January 1945, the war is entering its final brutal stages. The air is cold, biting. The distant rumble of artillery echoes through the stillness of the countryside as the U.S. Army pushes deeper into the heart of Nazi Germany. In the midst of the chaos, an unexpected scene unfolds. American soldiers, worn and weary, gather in a small clearing near a makeshift POW camp. Around them stand a group of German women, their faces gaunt, their clothes ragged, their eyes reflecting a mixture of fear, disbelief, and hunger. In the midst of this harsh reality, something as simple as bread becomes a symbol of survival, of compassion, of the faintest glimmer of humanity amidst the ashes of war. The soldiers, having witnessed the horrors of combat, now share a small, precious loaf of bread with the women. For a moment, the war stops. The bread, still warm from the oven, is offered without hesitation, an act of kindness in a world torn apart by violence. The women stare, unable to comprehend what is happening. For them, this simple act is more than sustenance. It's a moment of unexpected grace. As the bread is passed from hand to hand, it represents something far more profound than mere food. In this exchange, the true cost of war and the possibility for kindness even in its darkest hours begins to take shape. The year is 1945, and the world stands on the edge of one of the most catastrophic conflicts in human history. The Second World War is nearing its conclusion, but the toll it has taken on both soldiers and civilians is unimaginable. Across Europe, the tides have shifted. The Allies, led by the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, are closing in on Nazi Germany, their forces sweeping through occupied territories with relentless precision. The fate of the Third Reich is all but sealed, but the final push to end the war is a long, grueling march through the heart of a crumbling empire. By January 1945, the Soviet forces have breached the Eastern Front, capturing key territories like Warsaw and pushing westward into Germany. To the west, American and British forces have crossed the Rhine and are advancing into the heart of Germany. Cities like Aachen and Cologne have fallen, leaving the German military increasingly stretched and disorganized. However, the fighting is far from over. Germany, although facing inevitable defeat, is still fighting tooth and nail to hold on to every inch of its territory. The streets of Berlin are filled with desperation, while Allied forces are confronted with fierce resistance from the remnants of Hitler's once feared Wehrmacht. In this context, the U.S. Army, which had entered Germany with the promise of liberation, finds itself encountering a landscape of devastation and deprivation. For the soldiers on the front lines, the war is no longer just a battle for military supremacy, but a fight for survival in the face of dwindling supplies, shattered infrastructure, and a country torn apart by years of relentless conflict. These soldiers are not just liberators. They are witnessing firsthand the human cost of total war. And in this final push toward victory, their interactions with the German civilian population, often in the form of brief moments of compassion or violence, will leave lasting marks on both sides. The prisoners of war, POWs, particularly those held by the advancing Allied forces, are often forgotten in this larger narrative. The women, who had been rounded up during the chaos of retreating German forces, were not enemy soldiers, but civilians caught in a web of ideology, fear, and desperation. They had been subjected to the horrors of war just as much as the men, even though their experiences were shaped by different forces. As the U.S. Army continued its march through Germany, many of these women found themselves in POW camps, hungry, frightened, and in desperate need of basic human dignity. Dignity that, until then, had been stripped away by both war and their captors. In this critical moment, the soldiers, worn by the brutality of war yet still holding on to fragments of humanity, would offer something that transcended the lines of military conquest. Bread. A small loaf, given freely, would become an emblem of something larger. the enduring possibility of kindness in a world ravaged by violence. As the Allied forces closed in on Germany from all directions, the prisoners held by the Nazis found themselves in increasingly dire circumstances. For the German women held in POW camps, their fate was largely determined by the whims of the war and the changing tides of battle. Many of these women had been rounded up as the Third Reich's defeat became inevitable. Some were accused of supporting resistance movements. Others simply found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time as the war crumbled around them. The circumstances these women faced in the last months of the war were dire. As the Allies advanced, the Nazis, desperate to hold back the oncoming forces, often abandoned the women in hastily constructed camps. Food rations were dwindling, and any semblance of order began to break down. The guards, themselves weary and on edge, had little more to offer than brutal treatment and empty promises. Many prisoners, especially the women, were left to fend for themselves as their captors retreated further into Germany. In the chaos of the final months of the war, the concept of war crimes was not yet fully codified in the minds of the German people. Civilians, women and children included, were often treated as little more than expendable resources. In the eyes of Nazi Germany's brutal military machine, these women were simply collateral damage in the grander scheme of conquest and defeat. It was not uncommon for civilians to be forced into labor or internment camps, as the German leadership prioritized military objectives over civilian welfare. This ruthless mentality had been a hallmark of the Nazi regime from its earliest days. But as the Allies advanced, even those who had once been loyal to Hitler's cause were no longer shielded from the horrors of war. The U.S. Army's approach to the captured German women, however, was starkly different. While the Allied forces were undoubtedly driven by the need to end the war, there remained a level of compassion and dignity that was often extended to civilian prisoners. Despite the toll war had taken on them, the American soldiers had a different philosophy. Though they were soldiers in the midst of an unforgiving conflict, they still maintained a sense of moral responsibility, a belief that, even in war, humanity had a place. These values would come to the forefront in moments like the one that unfolded when the U.S. soldiers shared their rations of bread. For these women, bread wasn't just a physical sustenance. It symbolized something far greater, an act of mercy and recognition that they were human beings, worthy of respect, even in the worst of circumstances. It was a small but profound gesture, a brief respite from the horrors surrounding them. In those final days of the war, food was more than a necessity. It became a lifeline, and to receive it from an enemy soldier could offer a glimmer of hope in an otherwise dark world. But beyond the simple generosity of this act lay the backdrop of a war that had already caused irreversible damage. Cities lay in ruins, families were torn apart, and millions of lives had already been lost. For both the American soldiers and the German women, this moment of sharing bread would be a fleeting yet deeply impactful memory. An example of how, in the face of overwhelming destruction, even the smallest acts of kindness could become enduring symbols of humanity. As the American forces continued their advance and the war's end neared, both sides knew that the cost of victory would continue to haunt them long after the final shots were fired. The soldiers had witnessed the brutality of warfare and the lasting scars it left behind. They understood the enormity of the conflict, and they recognized that, even as they fought for a future free from tyranny, the echoes of the war would resonate across generations. For the German women who found themselves in the chaotic, frenzied world of wartime POW camps, life had become a delicate balance between survival and despair. These women were not soldiers, nor were they fighting for a cause they believed in. They were simply victims of a war they had no control over. Many had been living in areas that had been overtaken by the relentless march of the Nazi regime, and as the war dragged on, their lives had become a twisted reflection of the war's escalating horrors. Some of these women had lost their families in bombings, while others had been caught in the middle of German retreat operations. Starvation was rampant, and many had been exposed to the same physical and psychological toll as the soldiers on both sides. They had witnessed the collapse of the society they had known, their homes reduced to rubble, and had become subjected to the brutality of their captors and the harsh realities of being prisoners of war. The moment the bread was passed to them, they could hardly believe it. The American soldiers, men hardened by their experiences on the front lines, presented them with a symbol of kindness they had not experienced for years. For the German women, this small loaf of bread represented more than just nourishment. It was a profound reminder that, even in the darkest days of humanity, there was still a flicker of compassion that could pierce through the despair. Some of the women described the moment as surreal. Their faces, gaunt and worn, initially showed disbelief. They were not used to such gestures from their captors, and it was as though their minds couldn't immediately process the kindness being shown to them. They had been subjected to the cruelty of war for so long that, at that moment, the line between friend and foe seemed to blur. The bread, warm and freshly baked, was a fleeting reprieve, an unexpected act of mercy in a world that had offered them only cruelty. The emotional toll of the war on the women had reached its breaking point, and this moment became a brief yet powerful moment of human connection. This small, symbolic act was, for many, a turning point. It allowed them to remember that they were not simply prisoners of war, they were human beings, deserving of dignity. Even in a situation where their lives were reduced to mere survival, a small piece of bread offered them a semblance of hope and a reminder of the possibility of humanity. In the final months of World War II, military tactics were shaped by the desperate need for speed and efficiency. The U.S. Army had been fighting its way through Europe, and supplies were becoming increasingly scarce. As the Allies pushed deeper into German territory, logistical challenges became more acute. The constant supply lines, necessary to feed the soldiers, equip them, and maintain morale, were under extreme strain. Yet, amidst the logistical struggles and the brutal tactical calculations that determined the flow of battle, there was room for moments of unexpected generosity. The decision by U.S. soldiers to give bread to the German women POWs was, on one hand, a small, almost insignificant action in the broader scope of military strategy. But on another, it was symbolic of the contrasting approaches to war between the Nazi forces and the Allies. From a tactical standpoint, the gesture was not without risk. As the American soldiers advanced, the question of whether or not to extend acts of compassion was often debated in the heat of battle. The brutal conditions of war meant that every decision counted, and resources, including food, were precious commodities. Given the immense suffering among both soldiers and civilians, bread was a rare and valued item. Its distribution, especially in a POW camp, was a strategic decision made in a moment of grace, and it could have impacted the soldiers' own resources. However, it was not unusual for soldiers to make such decisions when faced with overwhelming hardship. Military ethics and human decency could sometimes take precedence, even if only for brief moments. The act of giving food was also a symbolic one. It reflected the larger philosophical divide between the Allied forces and the Nazi regime. While the Nazis had dehumanized their prisoners, often leaving them to starve or face horrific conditions, the Americans saw the war not only as a fight for military dominance, but as a moral crusade, fighting for the protection of human rights, freedom, and the future of civilization. The gesture of providing bread, an act of nourishment, carried weight beyond its immediate tactical significance. It also served as a psychological operation. For the German women who received the bread, this simple gesture could have shaken the foundation of their belief in the brutality of the Allies. Having been subjected to the Nazi regime's propaganda, they were conditioned to see the Americans as their enemies, perhaps even as their oppressors. But the act of kindness demonstrated something different. An opportunity for reconciliation, an opportunity for change in how they viewed the enemy. It was a small yet potent reminder that in war, humanity could still rise above the horrors of conflict. As the American soldiers marched through Germany in the final stages of World War II, they faced overwhelming technological and logistical challenges. Advancing into enemy territory meant confronting the consequences of a war that had ravaged Europe for years. German infrastructure had collapsed, roads were in disrepair, factories were bombed out, and food and fuel supplies were in short supply for both sides. The Allied forces, though superior in numbers and resources, still had to contend with the very real limitations of war: a shortage of rations, the strain on medical supplies, and the fatigue of the soldiers. Bread, in this context, became more than just food. It was a precious commodity, and its scarcity reflected the dire state of affairs. The U.S. Army was often stretched thin in terms of resources, with soldiers relying on their dwindling rations as they pushed eastward. As they moved closer to Germany's heartland, supply lines became increasingly difficult to maintain. The decision to share bread with the German POWs wasn't just an act of compassion, it was a demonstration of the resources at the disposal of the U.S. forces, and their willingness to share them, even in the midst of scarcity. While the soldiers were often hungry themselves, having spent days in combat without adequate provisions, the bread they offered came from a place of relative abundance compared to the German women they encountered. The U.S. Army's logistical support, at least at this point in the war, was far superior to that of the Germans. The Americans had not only secured steady access to food supplies, but had also mobilized industrial capabilities to provide for the troops. Meanwhile, Nazi Germany had been severely crippled by Allied air raids, resource depletion, and the collapse of their own military-industrial complex. This contrast in resources was not lost on the women in the POW camps. When the bread was handed to them, it was a stark reminder of the differences in how the war had affected both sides. The women, many of whom had witnessed the slow but steady disintegration of the German war effort, were accustomed to scrounging for even the smallest morsels of food. Their once abundant homeland had become a wasteland, ravaged by constant airstrikes and the unrelenting pressure of the Allied advance. For the American soldiers, giving up a ration of bread was not without its own cost. They were aware that they, too, were fighting against dwindling supplies. Yet, despite these conditions, they chose to share. It was, perhaps, a small act, but one that demonstrated how technological and resource advantages didn't always translate into cruelty or indifference. Even in the throes of war, the soldiers could remember the power of a simple gesture. The bread represented more than just a necessity. It was a symbol of abundance, of the very fact that survival could sometimes hinge on moments of humanity, not just power or resources. From the perspective of the German military, the final days of the war were characterized by desperation and collapse. As the Allies closed in on Germany, the once feared Wehrmacht, which had dominated Europe for nearly 5 years, was now a shadow of its former self. With each passing day, the war effort became more chaotic, more frenzied. German soldiers were exhausted, often underfed, and frequently disillusioned by the brutality of the fighting. Their morale had hit rock bottom as the realization of inevitable defeat set in. But for many of the German civilians and POWs, especially the women who found themselves in Allied hands, the war had a different dimension. The idea that Americans, the very forces they had been taught to view as enemies, could offer food, kindness, and mercy was incomprehensible to some. The Nazi regime had long painted the Allies, particularly the Americans, as subhuman, barbaric forces bent on the destruction of Germany. This propaganda was deeply ingrained in the German psyche, especially among civilians who had been living under the oppressive rule of Adolf Hitler's government. To them, the Americans were the invading enemy, a force of unknown soldiers who had come to destroy everything that was German. When the bread was given to the women, it symbolized more than just an act of generosity. It was a contradiction to everything the German military had taught them to believe. This simple, unspoken exchange struck at the very heart of Nazi propaganda. The Germans had spent years demonizing the Allies, framing them as cold and ruthless invaders with no regard for human life. To be handed bread, something so basic and vital to survival, directly from their enemies, soldiers who had just fought their way into their territory, shattered the illusion of the barbaric enemy. It was an unexpected reminder that, even in the heat of war, there was still a human element present in both sides. From the enemy's point of view, the act of giving bread could be interpreted as a form of psychological warfare. The German women, conditioned by years of ideological brainwashing and the harsh realities of war, could now see the Americans in a new light. The bread, in its simplicity, acted as a softening force, one that might have made the women question the narrative they had been fed for so long. As they chewed that warm loaf, the tension between the two sides, even if momentarily, dissolved. In a way, it was a small but significant blow to the image of the enemy they had been led to believe in. For the soldiers, there was perhaps an even greater internal conflict. Many of these men had seen the brutal realities of war, the destruction, the death, the cruelty. Yet in a moment of brief calm, they gave out bread, perhaps as much for themselves as for the POWs. It was a stark contrast to the brutal tactics of the German military, where prisoners often faced death or torture. The American soldiers were, in some ways, honoring the very ideals they were fighting for by offering this small yet significant gift. To the soldiers, it may have been a reminder that victory was not just about military conquest, but about winning over hearts and minds, even in the aftermath of a brutal conflict. For the German women, this gesture could have acted as a moment of reckoning, a realization that war, for all its cruelty, could still hold moments of grace. Their captors, once seen as ruthless invaders, were, in this moment, offering them food as if they were fellow human beings. That simple act of kindness defied the perception of the enemy that had been ingrained in them by years of Nazi propaganda. It served as a reminder that, no matter how intense the conflict, humanity could still find its way through the rubble of war. The moment when American soldiers handed fresh bread to German women, POWs, is emblematic of the larger moral questions that arise during wartime. War is, by its very nature, a brutal and dehumanizing force, stripping individuals of their basic rights and dignity. Soldiers on both sides are often forced to make unimaginable decisions, balancing the necessity of victory with the ethical challenges of how to treat prisoners, civilians, and the enemy. And yet, amidst the relentless violence, there are moments where morality shines through, where soldiers can find within themselves a fleeting sense of humanity. Even in the most challenging circumstances, the act of offering bread to those whom the soldiers were technically fighting against is an example of this moral complexity. For many of the American soldiers, this wasn't just about winning a war or defeating an enemy. It was about what they believed they were fighting for: the preservation of human rights, the end of tyranny, and the restoration of justice. In a way, by offering food to their prisoners, they were reaffirming these values in the very face of the conflict they were engaged in. It wasn't simply an act of charity, it was an embodiment of the larger moral cause of the war: the fight against oppression and for human dignity. For the soldiers, there was no grand gesture or immediate strategic benefit to giving out the bread. It wasn't going to turn the tide of the war. It wasn't going to secure victory in the field of battle. It was an act motivated purely by compassion, driven by the belief that, even in war, one's humanity must be preserved. This act stood in stark contrast to the often harsh and inhumane treatment that prisoners of war had received at the hands of the Nazis. The American soldiers knew what they were fighting against, the atrocities of the Nazi regime, but they also knew that to fight in such a way that they abandoned their humanity would mean losing the very ideals that justified their cause. On the other side, for the German women, the act of receiving bread became more than just an act of survival. It was a moral turning point. The war had stripped them of everything: their homes, their families, their safety. And yet, this act of kindness, something as simple as bread, spoke to them in a way that words could not. It reminded them that there was still goodness in the world, even if it seemed fleeting. It also raised questions about the morality of their own government's actions. In a moment when survival was all-consuming, the moral complexities of the war seemed to dissolve, and a simple gesture of care became a profound statement of what humanity could still offer, even in its darkest hour. The exchange of bread was not just about food. It was about the ethical crossroads that both the soldiers and the prisoners found themselves at. It was a reminder that even in the most savage of wars, the smallest act of compassion could offer a glimpse of hope and restore a sense of human decency. It was a moment that blurred the lines between the enemy and the friend, the victor and the vanquished, and highlighted how war, with all its destruction and hatred, still allowed for moments of kindness that would resonate long after the conflict had ended. The tension in the air was thick with the weight of the final days of the war. January 1945, and the American forces were moving through the heart of Germany with a relentless pace, pushing the German army into retreat. The war was nearing its end, but for the civilians and soldiers caught in the middle, the nightmare was far from over. There was little room for hope in these final days. Just survival, just the struggle to make it through the next day, the next hour, the next breath. It was in this grim setting that a seemingly insignificant moment would unfold, a moment that would resonate far beyond its immediate context. A small group of German women, herded together as prisoners of war, stood in a makeshift camp on the outskirts of an advancing American division. These women were not soldiers. They were civilians caught in the chaos of a collapsing empire, most having been detained during the final stages of the German retreat. They were hungry, exhausted, and terrified, their lives reduced to little more than survival in the face of an enemy they had been conditioned to hate. The soldiers who came upon them were weary, battle-hardened men who had witnessed the horrors of war firsthand. Yet, as they approached the group of prisoners, something remarkable happened. Amidst the grueling exhaustion and the desperation of their own circumstances, the soldiers did something unexpected. They gave them bread. The bread had been freshly baked, a small ration they had managed to spare from their dwindling supply. For the soldiers, this act wasn't about strategy, nor was it about victory. It wasn't even about a moral calculation. It was about something far more fundamental: compassion. It was an instinctive human response, driven by the recognition that even in a time of war, basic decency should not be abandoned. As the loaf of bread was handed to the first woman, the reactions were immediate and intense. The women stood frozen for a moment, the weight of disbelief on their faces. To receive food from their enemies was incomprehensible. These were the men who had invaded their homeland, who had come to end the very regime they had once served. And yet here they were, offering something as simple as bread. It was a profound moment of contrast to the horrors they had endured under Nazi control, where prisoners, especially women, had been treated with cruelty and disregard. For the soldiers, it was a moment of quiet reflection. They had been fighting for years, witnessing death and destruction on a scale they could scarcely comprehend. And yet, in that fleeting moment, with the bread passed from hand to hand, the soldiers were reminded of why they had fought in the first place. They had witnessed the cruelty of the Nazi regime and the suffering it had caused. They had come to Germany not only to defeat an enemy, but to restore a sense of justice, a sense of humanity that had been all but lost. As the bread was passed among the women, their initial hesitation began to fade. One by one, they reached out, accepting the gift. The smiles were tentative at first, unsure of what to make of the act. But as the bread was shared, something shifted. It wasn't just about sustenance, it was about a moment of unexpected grace in the middle of a war that had known no mercy. The scene that unfolded in the POW camp, though brief, would leave an indelible mark on both the American soldiers and the German women. As the bread was passed from hand to hand, the momentary silence felt profound. An unspoken understanding passed between the two groups. For the women, the act of receiving bread was a profound shock. It was an unexpected act of humanity, one that shattered the narrative they had been fed for so long by Nazi propaganda. These women, who had endured the worst horrors of war, looked at the soldiers who had once been painted as invaders and enemies. And yet, here they were, offering a simple, humble gift of bread, something that symbolized life itself in the face of starvation. The bread wasn't just a practical act of charity. It was a symbol of the moral divide that had shaped the war. And in this moment, it was clear that there were deeper forces at play. The American soldiers, despite being the victors, had not only defeated the enemy on the battlefield, but had, in a small yet significant way, defeated the enemy of hatred and dehumanization. The Nazi regime had systematically dehumanized the people it had conquered, treating them as expendable resources or enemies of the state. By offering bread, the soldiers were doing something more than just feeding the prisoners. They were reminding them that humanity could still exist, even in the aftermath of war. For the American soldiers, this moment was just as impactful. They had been fighting a war for nearly 4 years, exposed to the raw brutality of combat. The sights, sounds, and emotions of war had taken a toll on them all. Yet, despite everything they had seen, they were not so hardened as to turn their backs on a simple act of compassion. In the face of unimaginable destruction and suffering, they were reminded that the human spirit, even in its most broken form, could still reach out to others. The bread was an offering that spoke to the soldiers' own experiences, one that reflected their own internal struggle between the brutality of war and the desire for peace, kindness, and humanity. As the women received the bread, a moment of tension passed between them and the soldiers. It was a moment that encapsulated everything the soldiers had hoped for when they joined the war. The possibility of restoring some semblance of decency to a world turned upside down by violence and hatred. The women, too, recognized this, though it was hard to understand. Their world had been shaped by Nazi rule for so long that an act of kindness, especially from the enemy, was beyond comprehension. Some of the women, too, were unable to immediately process what had happened. A brief exchange of words, perhaps a nod, an awkward smile. These were the only signs of acknowledgement between the two groups. And yet, in those few moments, something changed. In the silence that followed the passing of the bread, there was a shared understanding that transcended language and ideology. It was a brief, fragile moment where compassion, rather than conquest, held sway. The bread, something so mundane in everyday life, had transformed into something extraordinary. For a moment, it wasn't about soldiers versus civilians, Americans versus Germans. It was simply about two groups of people, caught in the middle of a world consumed by war, who had reached out to one another across the vast divide of hatred and destruction. For the soldiers, it was a reminder of why they fought. For the women, it was a reminder that even in the darkest corners of war, there was still the possibility of kindness. In the midst of the carnage of war, where lives were lost daily and cities were reduced to rubble, the giving of bread became a silent, powerful statement that humanity could still exist, even in the most broken of times. The war in Europe officially ended on May 8, 1945, with the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany. The events that unfolded in the days and months leading up to that surrender marked the culmination of years of intense fighting. For the Allied forces, the victory was hard-earned, but it was also a victory of ideals, freedom, democracy, and human rights over a regime that had sought to impose a brutal, authoritarian vision of the world. But victory, as always, came at a heavy cost. The destruction across Germany was profound. Cities lay in ruins, millions of lives had been lost, and the psychological scars of the war would haunt Europe for decades. The German military was in disarray, and its civilians, many of whom had endured years of war, were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. In this broader context, the act of giving bread to the German women POWs was a small but significant moment. It was a brief glimmer of kindness in the face of overwhelming suffering. But it also spoke to the larger question of what it meant to win the war. Was it just about defeating the enemy on the battlefield? Or was it about restoring some semblance of humanity to a world that had been torn apart by hatred and violence? For the soldiers who gave the bread, it was a reminder that the true victory lay not just in military conquest, but in the ability to retain compassion and decency, even in the darkest hours. They had been fighting a war against a regime that had spread death and destruction across Europe. They had witnessed the full scope of the horrors perpetrated by the Nazis. And yet, in a moment of unexpected grace, they demonstrated that their cause was not just about military victory, but about something deeper, about the restoration of humanity in a world consumed by war. For the German women, the bread represented more than just a moment of sustenance. It was a reminder that not all enemies were the same. In the wake of the destruction caused by Nazi ideology, this small act of kindness served as a powerful counterpoint to the inhumanity they had witnessed under the Nazi regime. The women had been brutalized by the war, and many had suffered under the tyranny of Nazi rule. But in that moment, the bread offered a brief reprieve, a reminder that, even in the most difficult times, there were still people capable of kindness. Though the war's outcome was clear, the emotional and psychological aftermath would linger for years. Both the soldiers and the prisoners of war had been irrevocably changed by their experiences. The soldiers would return home to a world forever altered by the war, while the German women would have to rebuild their lives in a shattered country. Both sides would carry with them memories of war, not just the brutality, but also the moments of humanity that punctuated the chaos. The bread, then, symbolized the complex nature of war itself. It was both a destructive force and a potential source of redemption. In the aftermath of the war, this small moment would stand as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder that, even in the darkest of times, acts of kindness could still make a profound impact. The aftermath of the war saw a divided Europe, with nations left to pick up the pieces of a conflict that had reshaped the continent. For the American soldiers, the experience of the war, including moments like giving bread to the German women, was a bittersweet memory. They had fought for years, witnessed unimaginable suffering, and participated in some of the most brutal campaigns in military history. Yet, it was acts of kindness like these that left an emotional imprint on many soldiers. In the immediate aftermath of the war, many American veterans struggled with what they had witnessed. The horrors of war were never easy to forget, and the brutality of battle left many with deep psychological scars. Yet, the memory of these moments of humanity, these fleeting but powerful connections, stood in stark contrast to the violence they had endured. The bread, given to people who were technically their enemies, symbolized a return to basic decency and a reminder that their fight had been not just against an oppressive regime, but for a world where humanity could triumph over cruelty. For the German women who had received the bread, the end of the war marked a complex and painful chapter. They found themselves living in a defeated, devastated country. Many lost their homes, their families, and their sense of security. As the Allies took control, they faced the reality of rebuilding their lives amidst the rubble of a once powerful empire. The bread they had received from the American soldiers, though only a small gesture, represented something far larger, a reconciliation of sorts. It was a reminder that even after everything they had suffered, there was still some humanity left in the world, and that the road to recovery would not only be built on the defeat of the Nazi regime, but on the capacity for empathy and kindness in a broken world. For these women, the memory of receiving the bread would stay with them. It was not just the act of receiving food. It was the realization that, even in the midst of their suffering, they were seen as human beings, not just as enemies. This shift in perspective was critical for many of them as they navigated the complex post-war landscape. They had been caught in the war's brutality, and while the men who had fought against them were now allies, the emotional toll of the war remained. The bread was, in some ways, the beginning of their journey towards healing, even though the wounds of war would take years, if not decades, to fully close. The psychological consequences of war, for both the soldiers and the women, were profound. While the soldiers might have returned home to a degree of normalcy, the German women remained in a country that had been decimated by their own government. The bread, however, became a symbolic reminder for both sides of the cost of war, not just in terms of lives lost, but in terms of the humanity that was often lost in the heat of conflict. For the American soldiers, the act of kindness, though small, reminded them of the principles they had fought to preserve. For the German women, the bread symbolized a fragile thread of hope, a hope that, despite the atrocities of war, some good still remained. In the long term, the war's end brought a shift in global attitudes toward post-conflict reconstruction and the treatment of civilians and prisoners of war. The atrocities committed during World War II would serve as the foundation for the establishment of the Geneva Conventions and the Nuremberg trials, which sought to hold war criminals accountable and ensure that future conflicts adhered to principles of humanity. Acts like the one that took place in that POW camp, though small in the grand scope of history, resonated with the ideals of post-war reconstruction, that even in the aftermath of unimaginable destruction, there could be moments where humanity prevailed. As Germany rebuilt itself and the world moved toward the Cold War, memories of the conflict and of moments like the exchange of bread would linger. In the years to come, many veterans from both sides of the war would reflect on the relationships that had formed in the most unlikely of circumstances. The kindness shown in that moment would serve as a reminder that, even in the worst of times, people still had the capacity for compassion. The act of sharing bread, so simple yet so profound, speaks to the deep complexities of human nature and the cost of war. In a time when humanity was pushed to its absolute limits, when destruction and despair seemed unending, a small gesture of kindness cut through the darkness. It wasn't about strategy, nor was it about winning the war. At that moment, it was simply about remembering that, beneath the uniforms, beneath the divisions, there were people who still cared. War often distorts the essence of who we are. It creates divisions, erases empathy, and demands sacrifice at every turn. Yet, in those fleeting moments when soldiers chose compassion over cruelty, when the line between enemy and ally blurred, humanity found its voice. This exchange of bread between American soldiers and German women POWs was a small act in the grand scale of history, but it was a powerful reminder that even in the most brutal times, there are moments of grace that define us. For the soldiers, it was a reaffirmation of the ideals they had fought for, the belief that human dignity should be upheld, no matter the circumstances. For the German women, it was a flicker of hope in a world that had given them so little. The bread they received was not just nourishment. It was a bridge, however brief, between two sides that had been locked in a bitter struggle. And in that brief moment, both sides remembered that, despite the horrors they had witnessed, compassion could still endure. In the aftermath of such a devastating conflict, it is easy to forget these smaller acts, buried beneath the weight of history's great battles and victories. But it is these moments, the quiet, human moments, that remind us of the true cost of war. It is not just the loss of life, the destruction of cities, or the reshaping of nations. It is the toll it takes on the hearts and minds of those who survive, those who are left to rebuild, and those who are left to remember. The simple act of giving bread to the enemy, a moment of kindness in the midst of unimaginable destruction, is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It serves as a reminder that, even in the darkest times, humanity can still find a way to reach out to one another. And perhaps, in these moments, we see the true victory. The victory not of military might, but of compassion, which is the foundation of a world worth fighting for.